I've got it now, it's in my hands. We have the brand new Soulblight Gravelords Battletome, so it is time to dive into my absolute favourite faction in all of Age of Sigmar, the shambling hordes of skeletons and zombies, and their supreme overlords, the dark and powerful vampires. Now, despite being a new book, there is a lot that hasn't changed all that much from the original faction pack that was released when 4th edition dropped, but despite that, there are still a few nice surprises to discuss in this video, so let us not waste any more time. We've got the book, we've got the updated points, it's time to talk about death. So the Soulblight Gravelords battle traits, as I mentioned in my video the other day, they haven't changed too much, but there are some noticeable differences. You can see both on your screen side by side here, and immediately you will recognize a few familiar rules. The Hunger still lets you heal a vampire unit that has fought this turn for either D3 or 2d3 if it managed to destroy an enemy unit. The Unquiet Dead returns, allowing you to deploy a unit in the grave instead of on the board, and then bring them on with the Rising Dead. Now, the Rising Dead rule has changed slightly. It now lets you bring on a unit wholly within 6 inches of a Cursed Sepulchre, which is our new faction terrain, or wholly within 6 inches of the edge of a battlefield, and of course 9 inches away from enemies. This used to just be wholly within 6 inches of a terrain feature, so in some ways it is now a little bit more limiting, but in other ways you now have the entire board edge to play around with, so I think overall it's probably going to be a little bit better than it was before. It's definitely going to make your opponent have to second guess where on the table your units will be rising up from. Deathly Invocation is still once per turn in any hero phase, and it allows a hero to heal up to 3 friendly Death Rattle or Deadwalker units for 3, or return up to 3 models worth of zombies or skeletons, so no change there. There is, however, quite a big change to the Endless Legions rule. This previously cost you a command point and could be done once per turn, so essentially twice per battle round. This is now only once per battle round, so you can no longer do this in both your and your opponent's turn. However, to balance that out, they have dropped the command point cost for it. And you can bring a replacement unit back wholly within 12 inches of a hero or 6 inches of a Cursed Sepulchre, and of course 9 inches from enemy units. You do still, however, get to set up a unit 3 inches from enemy units if this is done in your movement phase, but you then can't charge. Despite that though, it's still a really strong way to do some great screening or to charge block an enemy unit that may be coming in the following turn. So I personally think overall it's better. Saving you a command point is fantastically good in my opinion, and it just makes the trait easier to plan around and just be assured that you can use it when you really need it to, because you don't have to be thinking about saving that command point to get it off. Finally, there is also a new trait. This is our terrain features. The ancient burial sites are our Cursed Sepulchres, and you set one up in the deploy faction terrain phase, and then this rule allows you to set up 2 extra ones in the deployment phase. Now, one can be 3 inches from all enemies' objectives and the other terrain features, whilst the second one has to be outside enemy territory, and again 3 inches away from enemies, objectives and terrain features. So you can get quite a nice spread of your terrain around the board and really set it up to help you get some good deep strike action from anything that you've got in the grave. So I think this is all round a fairly solid rule. Our faction terrain isn't the best otherwise, as we'll see a bit later, but this does certainly make it a lot easier for you to get your units of skeletons or zombies right where you need them to be. Also remaining mostly the same is the 4 battle formations. Legion of Shaiish brings the Horror Unending rule, which allows you to pick a 4th target for your Deathly Invocation. That can be great if you are spamming a load of zombies or skeletons, although I'll be honest, personally I find that 3 targets is usually enough for the games that I play. So your mileage may vary on this one. It could essentially be an extra 15 returned models over the course of the game. So if you are bringing at least 4 units that you think you're going to be wanting to use Deathly Invocation on, then it could be worthwhile. The Bacchanal of Blood is still an incredibly strong formation. This brings the Aristocracy of the Night rule, and this gives your vampire units +1 to casting rolls when they are not in combat, and +1 to wound when they are in combat, and they've made a charge roll that turn. So benefiting everything from your Blood Knights to your Vargheists to your Vampire Lords in a variety of ways. It makes you much better in combat and also much better at casting, which are of course two very important parts of the game. So this is just a super strong one, and I think probably the best of the bunch. If instead of vampires you want to go zombie heavy though, then the Death Stench Drove, that brings the rule Dragged Down and Torn Apart. This allows 3 Deadwalker units at the end of any turn to make a pile-in move and then pick an enemy unit in combat with them and roll a d3, and on a 2+ do that many mortal damage to them. So this is actually quite good for getting you some extra movement on your slower zombies and also things like your faster moving direwolves, as well as potentially getting you an extra 9 mortals going into the enemy every single turn. So that can obviously build up really quickly. Obviously this one is no good at all if you are running mostly vampires and skeletons, but if you are going zombie heavy, this could definitely be a good formation to get the absolute most out of them. Finally then you also get access to the Death March. This is the Death Rattle formation. Tide of Bones and Blades is the rule here, and when a Death Rattle unit charges, they get +1 rend on their weapons if they outnumber the enemy. Now, I kind of wish this rule was just +1 rend when you charged with Death Rattle, because a lot of Death Rattle units aren't super scary anyway, and whilst you can do it with a lot of their units, you aren't always going to be outnumbering your opponent. So for me, this can just be a bit of an annoying hoop to jump through. Don't get me wrong, getting an extra rend on your skeletons and your barrow units, as we will see, can make them quite scary, but I just think it is a bit too much of a hoop to jump through to make it competitive with, say, the Bacchanal of Blood. Overall though, I do like the formations. I think they all have a purpose, and whether you are going vampire heavy or skeleton heavy or zombie heavy, or just want that extra bit of recursion in your army, they are all useful and they have some value to bring. Just for me and my personal playstyle, I think the Bacchanal of Blood is the best. Equally staying mostly the same is the list of heroic traits, although there are some bigger changes, as we'll see, to the artifacts. The Lash of the Sire is still done in your hero phase and allows you to pick another friendly unit that is within the bearer's combat range, and you roll a dice, and on a 2+ you can make a move of d6 inches if that unit isn't in combat, or if it is in combat, it can make a pile-in. So potentially this can be used to get some extra models into combat range or help you get up and onto an objective a bit more easily. It's nothing super fancy, but more movement is always brilliant on a slow army like the Soulblight. Unending Will is next, and this still adds a nice bonus of letting you pick a Death Rattle or a Deadwalker unit wholly within 12 inches of the bearer, and they get to add d6 to their control score, so letting you much more easily flip an objective or just keep hold of one that you're on. It is critically important in Age of Sigmar and for Soulblight to play the objective game and keep hold of those objectives, and this is definitely going to help your skeletons or your zombies just keep hold of objectives as easily as possible, because you are going to be losing a lot of models just by the very nature of Soulblight, so getting that extra control really helps. The last one is Unhinged Rampager. This is still a nice passive ability that allows the bearer to re-roll charge rolls. So on a Vampire Lord or some other fighty hero, just allowing you to get into combat a lot more easily. It's still really quite strong. It doesn't bring a huge buff to the rest of your army, but if you have a hero that you want to be charging and getting into combat as soon as possible, this can make him much more reliable. On the artifact front, however, we actually lose both the Orb of Enchantment and the Amulet of Screams. The new ones are the Terminus Clock, which is used in your hero phase, and it gives the bearer the ability to roll a dice, and on a 3+, until the start of your next turn, enemy wizards are -1 to their casting rolls. So really impacting the spellcasting ability of your opponent, and for some enemy units, this can be devastating to how they play. So whilst yes, it is only on a 3+, so it's not always reliable, it can absolutely flip a battle in your favour against some armies. The Amulet of Screams, which went away, is now the Amulet of Graves. It is, however, totally different. It no longer is this anti-spell reaction ability. Now it interacts with your Curse Sepulchres, and once per battle in your hero phase, if there are less than 3 Curse Sepulchres on the battlefield, you can set one up more than 9 inches from enemy units and 1 inches from friendly units, and 3 inches from objectives. So it just gets you a terrain piece back if you've lost any, and as this is done in your hero phase, this can actually sneakily help you get a unit out of the grave in the movement phase right into a position your opponent wasn't expecting. So it's a bit niche, but potentially really quite powerful if you plan around it. The final option is a returning one. Shard of Night is still a passive that allows the bearer to ignore modifiers to save rolls against shooting attacks. Now this is both positive and negative, so no all-out defense, but on some heroes this could help you survive against a shooty heavy army, so if you're up against Lumineth or the Caradron, it could be useful. It's not always going to have an impact though, there are some games where it won't have any impact at all, so it's definitely a very, very niche one, and if you don't know what you're going up against, definitely not one that you're probably going to be taking just in case. But if you know what you're going up against and it is a shooty heavy army, could be one to consider. Now we're back to the spells though. Once again, we've got a very familiar bunch returning. These are all a 7+ to cast, so they're not the easiest, but Vile Transference is the unlimited one. This allows you to pick an enemy unit within 18 inches of the caster, and you roll for each model in that unit, and on a 6 you do a mortal damage, plus if any enemy models are killed you get to heal the caster for D3. So you can do some token damage on bigger units, it can have an impact, but being on a 6 it's not going to do a huge amount. The kind of like balancing out factor for that is that you get that D3 heal as well, so that could help you keep a wizard topped up a bit, and certainly on someone like Nagash that will be very welcome for keeping him around and on the board a lot longer. Prison of Grief is still a fantastic debuff, giving strike last to an enemy unit that's within 12 inches of the caster, so potentially using this in the enemy hero phase can really disrupt an incoming charge. Or of course, because it lasts until the start of your next turn, you can just chuck this on an enemy unit that you are expecting to charge, and then they may no longer want to in their following turn because they know that you will be fighting before they will. Lastly, we still have Waste Away. This is still utterly fantastic against certain enemies. You can pick an enemy unit within 12 inches of the wizard, and if this casts, their melee weapons are -1 damage for the rest of the turn. So if you've got some incoming cavalry that gets +1 damage on the charge, or just some big scary monsters with 2 or 3 damage coming your way, they are now going to be doing a lot less into your units, which could absolutely swing a fight in your favour. So it's another really strong, yes it's a bit short range, but it's a fantastic debuff to be able to throw onto a scary enemy unit, and in some cases essentially half their output. Something that is new to the Soulblight is their new manifestation lore, and as usual we will take a look at the specific summon war scrolls at the end of the video, but these are the brand new models and they do look fantastic, I have to say. The Hand of Nagash is cast on a 7 and it's set up 18 inches from the caster and 9 inches from enemies. Summon Unholy Reliquary and the Sanguine Swarm are both cast on a 6+. They are again set up 18 inches from the wizard. However, the Unholy Reliquary doesn't have to be a certain distance from enemies, so this can be set up right next to an ongoing fight, and it's a really great way to give some buffs or some healing to a hero that is involved in that fight, so it can be really, really handy, and as we will see later on in the video, they all have at least some use. None of them are amazing or must-takes, I don't think, but they definitely have some potential for supporting your battle plans. Before we get to that though, we will move on to the rest of the army's war scrolls, and we will start off, of course, with Nagash himself. We've seen him in the other Death faction reviews, and honestly there is nothing new here. He has dropped points slightly, he's now 840, but he still gets you the same 10-inch move, 18 health, 3 up save, 10 control wheel of stats, and a solid 5-up ward, so he is still quite durable. He's still a disgustingly good 9 cast wizard who gets +2 to cast and can keep casting after he miscasts with his Staff of Power. And then he still has things like Hand of Dust, which is his hilarious rampage that can just auto kill an enemy with a single dice. So super, super strong and scary, but also really quite swingy, and it's just a fun ability. Supreme Lord of the Undead allows him to replace an entire destroyed unit as long as it's not unique and not a hero, so bringing back potentially 10 Blood Knights is still on the card and it is ridiculously good. It allows him to pay for a big chunk of his cost right off the bat from that ability alone, and then he can still use his own spell, Invocation of Nagash, to either return some models to a unit or give a unit a 5-up ward save, or just do some more mortal damage to an enemy. I would say arguably he's still maybe a tiny bit overcosted, but at 840 points, if you manage to get a few good rounds of spellcasting from him, as well as returning that full strength unit to your army, he can definitely be something to work around. What you have to do with Nagash is plan your army around him, and then he can actually do quite a lot of work. He's still got the same attack profile as well, 4 attacks with d6 damage from Alakanash, and then 4 with 3 damage from Zephyr Niptar, which does help, but he's definitely not a pure melee combatant for that price. That's not the reason you bring him along. He is a pure machine gun caster, and you really don't want him getting into combat until later on in the game when he's absolutely ready to. Next up, we have a brand new Warscroll, Prince Vhordrai. Well, I say brand new, but it's kind of brand new. It's been updated, a new model. A few things have changed in it, let's put it that way. He is a whoppingly expensive 500 points, which is up 20 from where he was previously, and he is a terrifying vampire lord on a dragon. As I said, he's got that stunning new model, but in terms of rules, I would say he's just okay. His Warscroll has only 2 big changes. He's now got 18 health instead of 16, and then he's still a 12-inch move, 3-up save, 5 control model with a d6 shot, 10-inch ranged attack, which are 3s and 3s, 2 rend and 2 damage. So it's not too bad as far as ranged attacks go, but then in melee he's obviously a lot better. His mount, his dragon, Shordmane, throws out 3 attacks at 4s and 2s, 2 rend and 3 damage, and then 7 attacks at 4s and 2s, 1 rend and then 2 damage. And then Vhordrai himself has got his Blood Lance, which gives him 6 attacks. They're 3s and 3s, 2 rend and 2 damage, with +1 damage on the charge. So yes, he can do a lot of damage when he charges in, but he is very, very expensive. And I'd say he's maybe a bit too expensive because although he can do a lot of damage, and the fact that he is a wizard, that does help with his cost, don't get me wrong, but he is still just so pricey. His unique Warscroll spell is still Quick Blood, which grants him Strike First on a 7+, which can definitely make him a lot more terrifying as he's going in with a few other units. And then he still has the Saint of Slaughter rule that allows him to buff up friendly vampires quite well. So if a non-monster vampire unit destroys an enemy with a fight ability and is wholly within 12 inches of Vhordrai, then at the end of the turn he can buff them and give them either an extra attack, +1 damage, or +2 inches to their movement. Now these can all be applied to the same unit, but they can't stack again and again and again. So you can get a unit of Blood Knights with more movement, an extra attack, and +1 damage, but you can't get them 2 extra attacks or +2 damage, for example. So it is still a very, very strong rule, and it's going to make things like Blood Knights absolutely terrifying when they are fighting alongside Vhordrai. The other change to his rules is his Rampage. Snapping Jaws is gone, and now he has Trail of Crimson. This is actually incredibly strong. It allows him in any combat phase to pile in and then roll a dice and on a 4+ do that much mortal damage to an enemy. So potentially 4 to 6 mortal damage, which is really nice, don't get me wrong, but for me the real meat in this ability is the pile in. He doesn't need to be in combat. He can just pile in. So you can move up with Vhordrai and advance and not even charge, and then still potentially pile into combat range. So it gives him a really, really big threat, and it means almost nothing is going to be safe from him, and also that you don't always need to be relying on making a charge roll, because if you know you can just pile in with, you need to roll the advance obviously, which can be swingy, but it just gives him potentially so much more reliability at getting into combat, and it does just make him an absolute threat to almost anything the enemy may have on the board. I would say this alone does justify his points increase. I do think he's still too expensive, but that does make that increase understandable, I would say. Up next, we have the 2 Mortarchs for the Soulblight, and kicking things off, we have Neferata, the Mortarch of Blood. She's got pretty much the same profile. She is a 14 health, 12-inch move, 3-up save hero that is mounted on her Dread Abyssal Nagadron. She's a 2-cast wizard that does make her a very valuable addition to your army, and she's also a really good defensive buffer with 2 very strong abilities in Twilight's Allure, which makes nearby friendly units -1 to hit from enemy attacks, which gives you straight off the bat a load more durability for your units when they are wholly within 6 inches of her. and then she can also give out a further buff with her spell, Dark Mist. Now this is cast on a 7+, and it targets a unit wholly within 12 inches of her, and they get to ignore any save modifiers. So yes, it's ignoring positive ones too, which is a downside, but essentially it means that putting this on herself or something like your 3-up save Blood Knights, they are going to be making that 3-up save even against any scary 2 or 3 rend attacks. So it can bring, and it does bring, a massive boost to their survivability. It can just make her, especially, a 3-up unrendable save, -1 to be hit, and 6-up ward, and then with 14 health, so she can make herself or any other good save unit that you've got nearby to her just incredibly tanky. She's still got her movement ability in the Mortarch of Blood that allows you to pick 3 Death Rattle or Deadwalker infantry units in the deployment phase, and they can make a normal move, so getting your army just that extra bit of speed as well, and maybe making it a bit easier for you to move up and get some objective scoring, or maybe even some charges earlier on in the game. And then of course she's a Mortarch, so she's got a fairly scary amount of melee output as well. She's got 5 attacks that are 3s and 3s, 2 rend and 1 damage, with anti-hero +1 rend, 3 attacks that are 2s and 3s, 2 rend and 2 damage, and then Nagadron has got 5 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 2s, with 3 rend and 3 damage. So it's a lot all told. She can put out 26 damage in total, and it's made even better because if she manages to wound an enemy hero with Akhmet Ha, then at the end of that turn you can roll a dice, and on a 5+, that enemy hero is flat out destroyed. So it's not super likely being on a 5+, but insta-killing some big scary heroes and characters is in itself a really big threat factor that your enemy is going to have to worry about. She is a big investment. She's 460 points, but I think she's good. She's really fast, she's reasonably tanky, she's pretty killy, and she brings you some nice movement and defensive buffs to the rest of your army. And of course, being a 2-cast wizard does add a lot of value to her, so I think overall she's really not a bad pick. Mannfred is our other Mortarch. He's also pricey, but he is a bit cheaper at 430 points. Compared to Neferata, Mannfred is the same stat wheel, 14 health and a 3-up save, and also still a flying 2-cast wizard. He is, I would say, slightly less killy overall. His mount, Shigaroth, has the same profile with its claws, so 3 rend and 3 damage, but his own sword Geistvor is 6 attacks, 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage. So overall, he can actually do more damage than Neferata. He can do 12 compared to Neferata's 11, but I think with her better rend all around and hitting on 2s with some of her attacks, she is overall just a tiny bit more reliable in my books. In either case though, his main use isn't really his melee output. Instead, he is also a very good utility piece. His Mortarch of Night rule allows you to move into combat when you use the redeploy rule, which is fantastically good and can really blunt an enemy charge before they can get it off, or just massively put the enemy in a position that they weren't expecting to be in. It is just a very nice reactive move to have on him. You do kind of want him to be charging though, rather than redeploying into combat, because he does keep his other rule of Ashiragoth's Hunger, which is once per turn in any combat phase. If Mannfred has charged, then on a 3+ he gets strike first. And this is really good on him because if he's charging in, it means he is going to be guaranteed to strike first with all of his attacks before you can then potentially activate a unit nearby to him before the enemy. And why that's so good is because his other rule, the Sword of Unholy Power, is a passive where if he fights and kills any enemy models, then you get +1 attack to the melee weapons of friendly Death Rattle or Deadwalker units wholly within 12 inches of him. So Mannfred can charge in, fight first, and then all of your zombies, skeletons, barrow guard, and that kind of thing will get an extra attack if Mannfred kills anything. So you can massively boost their output as well. So it's just a really strong buffing tool. It is rather more offensive though than the defensive ones that Neferata brings. His final rule is his own spell, Wind of Death, which he still has. It's still cast on a 7 and lets you pick a point on the battlefield within 18 inches of him, and then up to 3 enemy units within 6 inches of that point. And you roll a d3 for each of those 3 units, and on a 2+, you do that many mortals to them. So it's a nice, relatively reliable way to potentially get up to 9 mortal damage onto a couple of enemy units, so it can definitely help to thin out a few enemies or injure a unit or a nearby character before they start to get too close to your lines. Next up we have the monstrous forms of the Vengorian Lord and Lauka Vai. Lauka Vai is 270 points, so still pricey but a good bit cheaper than our Mortarchs. She's still pretty much the same. She still brings that 10-inch move, 11 health, a 4-up save, and 5 control, which isn't terrible. The 4-up save, though, is a bit of a pain. She is a monster that can fly and is a 1-cast wizard, and she still has some fairly pokey output with 5 attacks from her sword, which are 3s and 3s, 2 rend and 2 damage, and then her gore-drenched talons are 3 attacks, 3s and 2s, 3 rend, and 3 damage. So some fairly acceptable output there. She's able to put about 8 or 9 damage into a 4-up save in combat. She's also got a very nice rampage with Impaling Talons, and this allows her in any combat phase where she is charged to roll a dice, and if the roll is equal or less than the target's health characteristic, you do that much mortal damage to them. So anything over 6 health, this will just do some guaranteed mortals, and on the turns when you manage to roll a 6 against something like a Mega Boss or a Chaos Lord will just be absolutely lovely because you will be almost one-shotting them before combat even begins. By Chaos Lord, I mean Chaos Lord on a mount, not just the foot version. I don't even know if they have a foot version, but the Chaos Lord on Karkadrak or the Demonic Steed I think has 8 health, if I remember correctly. Lauka Vai also has her own unique spell in the Queen's Diktat. This is cast on a 6+. It allows you to pick a non-unique Soulblight monster unit wholly within 12 inches of her, and you get to add D3 to the attacks characteristic of one of their weapons, essentially letting you get up to 3 extra attacks potentially on something like your Revenant Draconith's more attacks, which does make them very much scarier in combat. And then the final rule that Lauka Vai has, which she shares with the standard Vengorian Lord, is the defensive rule of Nightmare's Miasma. This gives enemy units -1 to their rend when they are in combat with her, so making her 4-up save feel a little bit less bad, although personally I still think it's a pain. I wish they still had that 3-up save they had before, just to make it that much harder for an enemy to actually push through damage into her. Overall, I would say she's not bad, but for a whopping 50 points cheaper, you could instead just spend 220 points to get the regular Vengorian Lord, who I think has a few slightly different rules that you might prefer. So the standard Vengo Lord, he's got the same 11 health, 10-inch move, 4-up save, the same defensive rule of Nightmare's Miasma to help keep him alive a bit longer. He is also a 1-cast wizard with fly. The main differences are that his sword is slightly weaker. It's 1 less attack and only 1 rend rather than 2, but then his gore-drenched talons are still that very good 3 attacks, 3 rend, 3 damage. Now he doesn't have his own spell, but instead he's got the Festering Feast rule, and that allows him at the end of any turn, if he did any damage to enemy units, heal himself and any friendly monster wholly within 12 inches of him up to D3 health. So he can massively improve the durability of a few units, and also this doesn't exclude hero monsters, so by my understanding he could in theory utilize this to heal himself and Lauka Vai, or even himself and some Mortarchs too, so he's got a lot of utility as this regeneration unit that gives him a huge amount of value when you are stuck in melee with him. He's also got a really nice rampage himself. It's done in any combat phase after he's charged. You roll a dice, and on a 3+, he gets to roll for each model in the unit he has charged, and you do a mortal damage to them on a 5+. So yes, it's a little bit unreliable on that initial 3+, but if you charge into a big unit of say 20 goblins or zombies and it goes off, you could be looking at nearly 7 mortal damage into them and just cutting through a huge swathe of an enemy unit before the fight even begins. So it's a very strong rule when it does go off. I would say Lauka definitely does have some advantage over him, but he is really good for healing, and I think for being 50 points cheaper, he does let you be, if nothing else, a bit more flexible in what else you bring in the army. He is largely the same in terms of output and defense, and I think just in general for that 50 point reduction in cost, he's probably a tiny bit better overall, although I certainly think if you are planning and running a monster mash style army, they both do have a place. Up next, we have a new unit for the army book, the returning Kado Ezekiar and his Warscroll, the Blades of the Hollow King. This is 3 models for 310 points, so it's definitely not cheap, but equally, it gets you 18 health with a 4-up save, 6-up ward that is a 1-cast wizard and has quite a lot of cool and interesting rules. They've got a mixture of weapons, with Kado wielding his Ezekiarian greatsword for 5 attacks, 3s and 3s, 2 rend and 2 damage, and the crit auto wound rule, while Sisendra has her twin blades, which are 8 attacks. They're only 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 1 damage, but they do have crit mortals for some potential spiked damage into the enemy. And then Kenistrix is the snake pet of Aurelius, and it's got 2 companion attacks, which are 4s and 2s, but then 3 rend and D3 damage. So it's very swingy, but that 3 rend is very nice, and the D3 damage does have the potential to do a lot of work. The Warscroll also has a nice selection of rules. We get a returning spell, Retribution or Salvation. This is cast on a 7, and it allows Kado to pick a unit within 12 inches to be the target. If it is an enemy unit, you do D3 mortals to it. If it's a friendly Death Rattle or Deadwalker unit, then you make that unit -1 to be wounded for the rest of the turn. So it's either a decent little bit of chip damage or a quite considerable defensive bonus to a nearby unit, which can be very, very helpful on something like a unit of Barrow Guard that is helping him. Aurelius is a Necromancer style part of the unit. He gives you a hero phase ability which allows you to add 1 to the unit's power level, letting you cast a second spell, or instead giving you a reroll of 1 of the dice when you cast. So you essentially either get 2 spells or 1 really, really reliable one. I personally think unless you need 2 specific spells to go off in a turn, the reroll is just better, because it makes it much more likely that you are going to get that 1 spell you need to successfully cast. So that would be my option most of the time. And then finally, you also get Kado's spooky ghost mentor Solia, and the rule that she brings is that in any combat phase, you can grant the unit either a 5-up ward, or you can give Kado's sword the crit mortals rule. So again, either a really nice defensive bonus, or just a way to make Kado even scarier in combat, and potentially getting you 13 attacks that can be doing mortal damage into the enemy between Kado and Sisendra. I actually do think it has a lot of potential. Yes, it's expensive, but it's a lot of attacks, it's a lot of wounds, it's got some okay casting potential, and it is just a really fun thematic unit. Is it worth that full 310 points? Maybe not, but equally, I do think, getting 18 wounds with a possible 5-up ward, that's not an awful way to spend those points. If you do really want to use this unit, you can definitely get value out of them. In a similar design to Aurelius, we also got another new character at the tail end of 3rd edition with Sekhar, the Fang of Nulahmia. She also returns. Sekhar is 210 points, and she is a great 2-cast wizard. She's got 6 health and a 3-up save, which does also make her reasonably tanky, and then her melee output is also quite good. She's got her Nulahmian Warglaive, which is 5 attacks with the crit 2 hits rule, and they swing at 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage, so the potential is there for 10 hits from her alone. She also has some companion attacks from her own snake. These are a little bit different to Aurelius's. They're 3 attacks, 4s and 3s, 2 rend and D3 damage. So again, it's not an amazing profile, but it's got a good bit of rend and some potentially good damage if you roll well on those D3s. One of her really big selling points is just how scarily durable she can be in melee, which is in large part due to her rule, Serpentine Agility. Now this is a passive that means when an attack is directed at her, an unmodified hit roll of 1 to 4 always fails, so she can only be hit on a 5+, so it makes it really, really difficult to actually get those hits through from an enemy. And then with her 3-up save and 6-up ward, it can take a lot more than you would expect to put her down. Things that normally hit on 3s, like say Chaos Warriors, they will now need something like 60 odd attacks to actually kill her, so she can be quite safe, at least for a few rounds in combat with most units. And then of course she does have the hunger because she's a vampire, so she can get some healing back too. So it's not that unfeasible for her to hold up maybe a full unit of 10 Chaos Warriors, if not more, all by herself until she manages to kill them off. She also gets her own spell with Death's Construction. This is cast on a 7+ and it lets you pick an enemy unit within 12 inches of her, and then until the start of your next turn, whilst any friendly units are wholly within 6 inches of Sekhar, they cannot be picked as the target for any abilities other than fight abilities by that target enemy unit. So basically giving you some protection from any spell or non-fight abilities that unit may have. It's not going to keep a unit totally safe because of course the enemy can still fight into them, but it can add a nice layer of protection from some spellcasting or other abilities that they may have on their war scroll. The final rule that Sekhar has is once per battle in any combat phase, you can choose to give up your Serpentine Agility ability, and then you get to pick each enemy unit she's in combat with and roll 2d6 for each of them, and if your roll beats their unit's movement characteristic, they take mortal damage equal to the difference. So if you were in combat with a unit of Chaos Warriors and a Chaos Lord, both with movement 5, you would roll 2d6 for each, and then if you say rolled an 8 against the Warriors, they would take 3 mortal damage, but if you rolled an 11 or a 12 against the Chaos Lord, then you would of course minus 5 from that, and end up doing 6 or 7 mortal damage. So it's potentially a very, very strong way to spam out a load of mortals into the enemy. And especially if you are in combat with infantry units or slow moving enemies like Death Factions or the Maggotkin, you can do an obscene amount of damage. Now, yes, you do give up your durability a bit by losing that only be hit on 5s, but doing this in maybe the last combat phase of the game can just be brutally good for trying to shift an enemy unit maybe off an objective that you need. We've got another character up next, the first version of Radukar, which is him as Radukar the Wolf. This is one of the Cursed City models, but he isn't going away like the rest of the range next year, which is really nice. He is actually in the army book. If you want an alternative Vampire Lord, he can bring a few different tools. He is also a tiny bit cheaper than a regular Vampire Lord. He's at 130 points, but what he gets you is a 7 health, 4-up save model that is a 1-cast wizard and has got a fairly standard melee profile, 5 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend, 2 damage, and have crit mortals. So it's nothing super exciting, but it's kind of what you expect from a foot hero, and he can fight reasonably well into enemy infantry units. Where Radukar does excel is that he can get you some extra damage from units nearby to him. So Master of the Pack is his Warscroll spell that is cast on a 6+, and it lets you re-roll charges for friendly infantry units wholly within 12 inches of him, so giving himself and any zombies or skeletons and that sort of thing much more reliability at getting into combat. And then this combos really well with his other rule, Call to the Hunt, which is a passive that grants any Death Rattle or Dead Walker infantry that charge this turn +1 to wound on their melee attacks while they are wholly within 12 inches of him. So he himself won't get this bonus, but again, any skeletons or zombies or barrow guard will be getting +1 to wound into the enemy, and that can make them much scarier into your opponent on a turn they've charged in with Radukar. If instead you want to go for a more expensive but potentially more frightening version of Radukar, you can go for his Beast form, which is a much more expensive 270 points, so it's 80 points more, but in return for that, you get 12 health, you get a much better 8-inch move, and you get the same 4-up save. He also has a fairly good control score of 5 to help him steal objectives after he's killed a load of enemies that might have been on it, and he is really good at doing that. He's got a whopping 6 attacks from his claws, which are 3s and 3s, 2 rend and 3 damage, and have crit mortals, and then also 6 more attacks from his Bloodborne attendants, which are also 3s and 3s, but 1 rend and 2 damage. So essentially, he's got an extra Vampire Lord's worth of attacks on top of his own already beefy profile. All told, from Radukar you can look to do nearly 12 damage to a 4-up save, but he can even do around 9 damage to that much better 3-up save, so he alone can nearly wipe out 5 Chaos Warriors in a single go, so that just makes him this incredibly scary melee torpedo unit to send into the enemy and really help you flip an objective. He's also got a very strong rampage that allows him to make a d6 move at the end of any turn as long as he isn't in combat, and then this rule, the Beast Will Out, also lets him move into combat if you want, so it can be a brilliant way to just get him up the board quicker or engaged in melee before the enemy can try and get a charge off in their turn. He's also got the same rule, Call of the Hunt, which is like his wolf version. It gives friendly Death Rattle and Dead Walker units +1 to wound if they've charged and are wholly within 12 inches of him. So he does also bring some of those nice bonuses to your nearby units as well. But then his final unique rule is his own spell, which is different to his wolf version. This time he gets the Armor of Night. This is cast on a 6+, and it grants Radukar -1 to be hit and -1 to be wounded. So this is a really strong defensive tool, especially when he only has that 4-up armor save and 6-up ward base to protect him. What's really annoying about this is that it does need to be cast. Previously, I think in 3rd edition, he wasn't a wizard, and this was just a base passive that he had. So I do think this does make him a lot less reliable on the durability front, because you can't always count on this going off. But when it does go off, it makes him incredibly tough to put down. And when you've got this buff up on him, even a full unit of 10 Chaos Warriors will only do around 4 damage to him, so he can be incredibly difficult to get rid of. It's just uncertain that you're going to get it off, because even though it's on a 6+, which isn't super difficult, you can't rely on it, and I personally would prefer it if he wasn't a wizard and he just had this all the time again. That isn't the end of the Verkos-inspired units though. Ivya Volga also returns. She's a relatively new model as well, and she's got a fairly scary anti-monster profile. She does come in at a quite cheap 120 points, and for that you get a 5 health, 5-up save, 6-inch move, 1 cast wizard, which as far as vampires go is quite squishy, but she does have a lot of use. She's got an okay shooting attack, 2d6 shots at 12 inches, which are only 4s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage, so they're not going to do much, but maybe killing off a few light chaff infantry as she moves up. And then she's got a fairly standard Vampire Lord melee profile with her axe, 5 attacks, 3s and 3s, 1 rend, 2 damage, and then +1 rend against monsters. So she really wants to be going after those bigger, scarier creatures that the enemy may have. She's also got some really nice defensive tools to help get around that bad 5-up save. She is always -1 to be hit thanks to Shrieking Swarm, which does help keep her alive a little bit longer, especially into those monsters which will be normally hitting on 4s. Making them drop to 5s is a big debuff for them. And then she can make them even less scary with her rule Behemoth's Bane. This further impacts monsters and drops their attack characteristics of their melee weapons by 2 when she's in combat with them, so making something like a Sephiron Stegodon go from 6 attacks that hit on 4s to 4 attacks that hit on 5s is a really big debuff for them, and it can make even the biggest, scariest monsters feel very ineffective when they are in a combat with her. Her final rule is Total Dominance, which is her unique spell. This is cast on a 6+, and it subtracts 5 from an enemy monster's control score when they are within 12 inches of her. So she can move into combat and basically drop the control of a lot of monsters down to almost 0 a lot of the time, and then just absolutely ruin their plans for holding an objective, as well as making their really scary attacks do way less damage into your army. So if you are up against a lot of monsters, or you know you're going to be fighting some Sons of Behemat, she can be a very good addition for 120 points. Next up we have the Matriarch of the Verkos. Beladamma Volga is back with her wolf mount. She is 220 points, so she's not cheap, but she is quite good at what she does. She is a 2-cast wizard. She doesn't have the best defensive profile though, 9 health with a 4-up save and the usual 6-up ward. She is, however, an 8-inch move, and as I mentioned, a 2-cast wizard, which does add a lot of value for that price tag. She's unfortunately not quite as scary as regular Vampire Lords. She has got 4 attacks that are 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage, but then she does get 6 more from her wolf, which is 4s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage. So she's certainly not a melee powerhouse for her cost, but she can do okay at least into lighter chaff, just through the sheer weight of having 10 attacks. What Beladamma is all about though is casting and wolves. Her unique spell, Under a Killing Moon, is cast on a 7, so it's not the easiest to get off, but it lets you pick 3 direwolf units wholly within 18 inches of her, and then they get +1 rend on their melee weapons, and they also get to ignore the beast rule, so they are much better at killing now, and also now much better at holding an objective for you. Having 3 buffed up units can actually make them fairly efficient infantry blenders with the full 20 attacks that a unit can have. She also works to buff up your other Vargheists character units with the first of the Vargheists passive. This grants 3 to the control score of Radukar the Wolf, Radukar the Beast, Ivya Volga, Lady Annika and Kritza, whilst they are wholly within 18 inches of her. So that does give all of them a load more utility as well if you are going for this character heavy Vargheists inspired army. And then finally, whilst as I said she's not got the best defensive profile, she can also be a bit more durable thanks to the Wolfguard rule, which gives dire wolves that are in her combat range to the chance to essentially tank some damage for her. So Beladamma gains a 4-up ward save, but instead of just negating the damage if she passes it, if she makes a successful ward, it just bounces off that damage onto a nearby direwolf. So you're not saving the damage completely, it just protects Beladamma from taking it and forces it onto a less important unit. And then going back to the characters that we mentioned just now that she buffs, Lady Annika is up first and then closely followed by Kritza. These are 2 very quirky and quite unique units. Lady Annika is 130 points. She is a vampire, but annoyingly she's not a wizard, which would have been a very nice boost to make her worthwhile. She's 5 health and a 5-up save, so you may think she seems fairly squishy. However, she does have a base 4-up ward, which is very, very good in 4th edition, and against 1 damage attacks, she's only slightly less durable than a comparable 3-up armor save, 6-up ward regular vampire lord. She's also got a slightly different melee profile. She's got 7 attacks, which are 3s and 4s, 1 rend and 2 damage. So that actually makes her almost as good as a vampire lord into a regular 4-up save profile. She's a tiny bit less durable and a tiny bit less offensive, but it's not a huge amount. Her rules, however, are what make her stand out. She's got a rule Supernatural Speed, which allows her to be deployed off the board as she is lying in wait, and then she can come onto the board in your movement phase with Starving Nightmare, and this allows her to deploy wholly within enemy territory and 9 inches away from all enemy units. So you can play some really quite nasty movement shenanigans and put a threatening unit right in the enemy backfield from the start of the game to put a load of pressure on them. And then her other rule is Kiss of the Blade Proboscian, which is her melee weapon. What this does is at the end of any turn, if she's done any damage to an enemy unit, you can roll a dice, and on a 2+, that enemy unit is -1 to their save rolls for the rest of the battle. So you can really quite seriously debuff enemy units and make them a lot easier for the rest of your army to kill. The big issue with Lady Annika, I think, is that she isn't that hard to kill herself, so it might actually be tricky to get this off without getting Annika killed herself. So she can be a bit of a hard sell. She is quite fun and unique and cool, but I think the price of her, as well as the fact that you are not getting that spell casting potential that you would get from a regular vampire lord, does make her just worse as an option. Equally, we have Kritza. This is another 5 health, 5-up save vampire that isn't a wizard, which is annoying. He also only has a 6-up ward, so he is incredibly squishy when he's stuck in melee. The good thing about Kritza, though, is that he doesn't really need to be stuck in melee. He's got 2 fantastically good rules. The Verminous Court allows him in any combat phase to pick an enemy unit he's in combat with that has an artifact of power, and on a 3+, you essentially steal their artifact and the enemy can no longer use it. Now, you don't get it and get to use it or anything, but denying your enemy an important artifact that was crucial for their battle plan or buffing their army is, if nothing else, utterly hilarious. It does make him a really sneaky unit to throw into enemy heroes, and then he's also got some disgustingly good durability as well, because although, as I said, his stat line and defensive profile is bad, he's got another rule, Scurrying Retreat, which lets him in any combat phase roll a dice and on a 3+, use the retreat ability immediately without taking any mortal damage. Now, it's worth remembering, combat phase abilities are done before any fight abilities, so you can charge him in and then both steal an enemy artifact and yeet him back out of combat to avoid being hit before any fight abilities take place. It's hilariously strong. It would make him an absolute auto take if both of those abilities weren't done on a 3+, so they are not the most reliable, and you will sod's law charge him into a combat, steal an artifact, but then fail the 3-up to retreat him and just end up being killed by the unit you charged into. So he isn't reliable, and I think for that purpose he's maybe not worth taking. But at the same time, he's really funny. He is very durable a lot of the time. He can absolutely frustrate your opponent and make them scared to put a hero with an artifact anywhere near him. And he's also really quite cheap at 70 points. He's also got some okay output, I guess. Like, he is a vampire. He's got 5 attacks, 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage, but then also the crit 2 hits rule. So he's not bad. But I mean, yes, realistically, you want that 3 up to go off so you can get him out of combat and scurry away. But if he is into sort of really light, weak chaff units like goblins or zombies or skeletons, he can actually do okay damage. He's really great, and I want to love him because I think he has a load of potential. I just think relying on his 2 abilities, both being on a 3+, does make him a little bit of a hard sell, even for just 70 points. On to the more generic Vampire Lords now. The first up is the Lord on Nightmare Steed, who is the stunning new model we got with this release. This guy is just flat out good. He's 210 points, so he is pricey, but that gets you an incredible 12-inch move, 1 cast wizard, 7 health units with a 3-up save and the usual 6-up ward, so it's a fairly solid little profile. He's also a good bit better in melee than a normal Vampire Lord. His dynastic weapon is 5 attacks that are 3s and 3s, 2 rend and 2 damage, and also +1 damage on the charge, so 3 damage when he's charged in, which is really good. And then he's also got a couple of extra attacks from his horse. They're only 5s and 3s, no rend and 1 damage, but that might plink off 1 extra wound if you're lucky. Where he really comes into his own is buffing your cavalry units. And as we saw in the preview from earlier the other week when they were previewing the army book, he lets a Blood Knight unit re-roll charges if they are wholly within 12 inches of him after he's made a charge. You also get to reroll his charges, so essentially getting 2 potential rerolls out of his For Glory for Blood ability. And then on top of that, it also allows you to essentially double charge in the enemy turn. So if you counter charge with him, then a nearby unit of Blood Knights also get to use the charge ability immediately after he does, even if it isn't your charge phase. So using counter charge on the Lord, you can then essentially use counter charge on your Blood Knights for no command points, so you can get 2 units charging in the enemy turn for just the cost of 1 counter charge. It's a fantastic rule, it really is, and it makes him and some nearby Blood Knights incredibly frightening into the enemy. What he also does is buff them even further, because Strike at the Heart grants them +1 rend on their Templar weapons if they are wholly within 12 inches of him and have charged that turn. So he and a unit of Blood Knights are just really reliable at getting into combat. They can get a load of good charges off, and then they are even more powerful when they do get into combat. So just him and a unit of Blood Knights, super strong, a great combo that I think you're going to see a lot. And at 210 points, yes, he is pricey, but if you are bringing any units of Blood Knights in your game, I would say he is almost mandatory just to get the most out of them. The generic Vampire Lord in comparison is a much cheaper 140 points. And in comparison to, say, Radukar the Beast, he does have less wounds, but is a slightly better save. He's got 5 health with a 3-up save, so he's fairly standard in terms of durability. In melee, however, they have improved slightly since last edition. 5 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, but now he gains both anti-hero +1 rend and the crit 2 hits rule. So now your Vampire Lords are significantly better into both enemy heroes and also bigger squads of chaff, thanks to those exploding 6s. So it's not awful as far as melee profiles actually go, but still nothing super amazing. They are still a 1-cast wizard, but they don't unfortunately have a Warscroll spell, which is a shame. Their only extra actual Warscroll ability is Sanguine Blur. This is done once per turn in your hero phase, and it gives your vampire the ability to be removed from the battlefield on a 3+, and then set up again 9 inches from enemies or 3 inches from enemy heroes. So if your opponent has misplaced a hero and they've got one that is off by themselves, you can potentially sneakily get a Vampire Lord there and get off an almost guaranteed charge into them. It can be a bit tricky to set up because most people will have some other infantry nearby, and you do still have that regular 9-inch zoning from non-hero units, but still it can be a very nasty surprise if your enemy has misplayed slightly and they end up finding a Vampire Lord right next to their squishy hero right from the start of the game. From the Vampire Lord though, we move on to another brand new unit. The old zombie dragon is gone and has been replaced by the new, but actually much the same, Revenant Draconith. The Draconith is 260 points, and for that you get a 12-inch move, a 16 health monster, but it only has a 5-up save and a 6-up ward. So despite the good number of wounds, it really is very, very, very squishy, and it will die much faster than you would expect from such a big, imposing dragon. It does still have a fairly similar damage profile to the old zombie dragon. Its breath attack is now 5 attacks. They hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and they can still shoot in combat, which is nice. And then in combat, it's got 3 attacks with its maw, which are 4s and 2s, 2 rend and 3 damage, and then 7 attacks from the claws, which are 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage. So overall, it will throw about 7 damage into an enemy 4-up save in combat, which isn't nothing, but equally isn't super amazing for 260 points, I don't think. You can make it a little bit more impressive with its rampage, which is now called Red Ruin. This is a change from the original faction pack. This rule now allows you at the end of any turn to pick an enemy unit in combat range of your Draconith, and you roll a d3, and on a 2+, you do that much damage to the enemy unit. You heal your Draconith for that much health, and also your Draconith can be removed from the battlefield and set up in the air, ready to come in reserves in your following movement phase. So there's quite a lot of good stuff going on there. You can do some chip damage, you can get a bit of healing, and just a way to get some extra mobility out of the unit. So it is quite a good rampage, albeit it is one that is a little bit unreliable because it needs that 3-up to go off. You do also get the standard deployment rule of Death on Tattered Wings, which allows the Draconith to be set up in the air instead of deployed on the board, and then you can drop it in with Loathsome Descent. Again, more than 9 inches from enemies, so if you don't want to rely on its 12-inch move, or you're worried about some first turn shooting from the enemy, you could use this to help you get up a bit closer to the enemy in your movement phase, or put it down and threaten a flank that your enemy may have left exposed. So it does have some utility. It is just a bit too expensive for my tastes. It can do some okay damage, don't get me wrong, but it's nothing amazing. And with that 5-up save and 6-up ward, it is just so squishy, even with that 16 health. We've already touched on the Blood Knights, but they are up next. They are still a solid 12-inch move, 3-up save, 3 health units with 5 models base. They do get a champion, which is nice, and then 1 in 5 can be a standard bearer, which also helps. For a now slightly cheaper 220 points, they are quite good for their cost. They are essentially 44 points per model, and with 3 attacks each at 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage on the charge, as well as a couple of extra attacks from their horses, that isn't a terrible bit of output, especially if you get the +1 to wound from that vampire-focused formation from earlier. They really can do a lot of work. They also get some really nice rules where they can actually move through enemy infantry with Riders of Ruin, which really does help them get to where you need them to be and charging into a key target rather than bogged down by chaff. On top of that, they can also do some token mortals to a unit they do pass over with their other rule, Trampled to Dust. This lets you roll a d3 against an enemy unit you've moved over, and on a 2+, you do that much mortal damage to them. So this essentially lets you charge over a screen into a more important unit behind them, and still do some mortal damage to that screening unit as you go. For a slightly different style of vampire unit, we have the Vargheists. These are squishier, but they can in some ways be even more mobile than the Blood Knights. For 120 points, you get 3 of them, and they are 4 health with a 12-inch move, fly, and a 5-up save. So they're not the most durable of units. However, their rule, Death's Descent, allows them to be removed from the table in any movement phase that they are not in combat, and then reset up on the board 9 inches from enemies. So they can really get around the board quickly and go and score you some objectives or missions, or just harass the enemy backlines really easily. They're also not awful in combat for their cost. They're 3 attacks each, which hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, but they do get the crit 2 hits rule. So even a minimum unit of 3 will be looking at killing off 5 4-up save models in a single go. So they really are very good and fantastic at bullying smaller units off objectives and then taking them for your vampiric overlords. And that is really the big use and play with these guys. Another vampire unit that we have access to is the, again, relatively new Askurgan Trueblades. They are an infantry unit with 8 models that is going to cost you 120 points. And they come in the form of an Askurgan Exemplar, who is the champion, and then one other unique model, the Curseblood, who is essentially a big werewolf. The other 6 are just sort of your basic infantry. The unit has 2 health each and a 5-up save, so essentially you're getting 16 health in total, and it's got a 6-inch move. It's got a relatively poor 1 control, but they do get quite a lot of attacks. 7 of the 8 have Askurgan weapons, which are 2 attacks each that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage, but they do have the anti-monster +1 rend and the crit 2 hits rule, which is nice. And then the Curseblood adds 5 extra attacks to that, which hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 2 rend and 1 damage. So yes, it's all quite low 1 damage, but into monsters especially, they can do a lot of work. Their output and actually their durability is made even better though, thanks to their Creed of the Askurga Renkai rule, which is a passive, and it makes them -1 to be hit by enemy monsters, and also gives them +1 to hit enemy monsters themselves, so they are also more durable and more damaging to any big scary beasts that your opponent has. Finally, the Curseblood also brings another very strong, if now a bit unreliable, rule. Gut-wrenching Howl allows you to roll a dice in any combat phase, and on a 4+, you can pick an enemy unit you are in combat with, and they get strike last. So it is a devastatingly good effect. It's just on a 50-50 dice roll, essentially, so it can't really be relied upon, and that does make them a bit more difficult unit to sell. But still, into an enemy 4-up save monster, this 120 point unit will do over 10 damage, so you can massively injure, if not outright kill, a good lot of monster units. So they can be quite effective for their cost. They're also quite reliable and durable against monsters, because of course being -1 to hit means that those 4-up to hit monsters are going to only be hitting that unit on 5s. Although, as we saw in the previews, the Bloodseeker Palanquin has gone from the army book, we do still have the Coven Throne and the Mortis Engine, which are the similar designed options. The Coven Throne is still 250 points and is 12 wounds, a 4-up save, 10-inch move war machine that also happens to be a hero. It is a flying 1-cast wizard that can give friendly Death Rattle and Deadwalker units a 5-up ward save, whilst they're wholly within 6 inches of it, which is quite nice. It does add a lot of durability to a few of your squishier units. It can also put out some decent attacks from its numerous profiles. It's got 5 attacks from the Matriarch Stiletto, which are your standard Vampire Lord attacks, 5 at 3s and 3s, 1 rend, 2 damage, and the crit 2 hits rule. Then you get 6 further attacks from the Acolyte's Poniards, which are also 3s and 3s, but only 1 rend and 1 damage. And then some token Spectral Blade attacks. There's 10 of them, but they're fairly mediocre, 4s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage, so that isn't really going to do much, but combined, they can have a decent amount of output. The extra rules you get on this thing though can be fairly nice. Scrying Pool is a passive that allows a Soulblight unit wholly within 12 inches of your Coven Throne to use the redeploy command, and then immediately after that, you can pick another Soulblight unit wholly within 12 inches to also use that command without spending a command point. So essentially this can get you 2 redeploys for just 1 command point, which is very, very good for your command point economy. It also gains a brand new rule with a promising concoction. This is once per battle in your combat phase, you can pick 3 vampire units wholly within 12 inches of the throne, and they get +1 attacks on their melee weapons for the turn. So Blood Knights, Vampire Lords, Vargheists, even your Mortarchs who are both vampires, they will absolutely love this. It can massively boost your damage output for that one vital turn. So yes, this thing is pricey at 250 points, but it can be a very good force multiplier, and it gives anything from your zombies to Prince Vhordrai some kind of boost in your games. The Mortis Engine, on the other hand, is slightly cheaper. It's 240 points. It's got the same 10-inch move, 12 health, 4-up save. It is also a flying 1-cast wizard, but this thing is a lot less dangerous in melee. It's got the same 10 spectral blade attacks, but then the Corpse Master, essentially being just a Necromancer, is a lot worse. He's only got 3 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and D3 damage, so it's nothing particularly exciting there. It still does have the same rules with the Reliquary, where you place a stored energy dice next to it the first time it's set up, and then whenever a friendly Soulblight wizard successfully casts a spell within 12 inches of this unit, you add 1 to the value of the dice, and this starts at 1 and can go all the way to 6. And you can then use that stored power with the Wave of Power rule. Now this is done once per turn in your shooting phase. The Mortis Engine can pick up to 3 enemy units within 10 inches, and you roll a dice for each target, and on each 3+, you do mortal damage equal to the stored power on the dice, and then it's reset to 1. So this can essentially be hitting 3 enemy units and doing 6 mortal damage to each of them. So you can do a maximum of 18 mortal damage in one shooting phase across 3 enemy units with this, which is insanely good. And having, this by Nagash, or even some of your 2-cast wizards like the Mortarchs or Sekhar, you can really build up that power to 6 quickly, and then you can quite reliably put at least a couple of wounds, a couple of mortal damage into a few enemy units that are within 10 inches. So this is a really, really strong shooting phase rule. The other rule for the Mortis Engine is the Nexus of Death Energy. This is a great utility trick. It lets you add D3 to the amount healed when you use Deathly Invocation on a Death Rattle or a Deadwalker unit wholly within 12 inches. So potentially letting you get up to 6 models return instead of just 3, or healing a whopping 6 health on something like your bigger models like your White Kings. And speaking of the White Kings, he's up next, the one on Skeletal Steed. He is a very pricey 220 points, which has increased 80 points from the original army book release. The White King is 8 health with a 10-inch move, a 3-up save and a 6-up ward, so he is fairly tanky, all things considered. He is also very killy. He's got 5 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s, with 1 rend and 2 damage, but they also have the crit mortals and +1 damage on the charge, so he can potentially be doing 15 mortals when he charges in, best case scenario, which is very, very good. He also gets to give friendly Death Rattle units +1 to hit when they are wholly within 6 inches of an objective or a terrain feature that you can pick in your hero phase, which does boost the output of both him and any skeletons that are nearby. And then finally, he has the Ancient Barrow Curse, which is actually a rule I think that needs a bit of an FAQ now. It makes an enemy unit cursed if he scores a critical hit on them, and that makes them -1 to their saves for the rest of the game. But there is some questions about, because it's a passive, about whether this sticks around when he dies, and I think the general consensus is that it doesn't, but I do think it just needs to be clarified. If this drops off after he dies because that passive ability is now gone, it's less good, but obviously if it stays around all game, it's incredibly strong. Either way, it is a very good rule because dropping saves on an enemy unit is very strong. It can utterly ruin something like a 3-up save Chaos Warrior unit by dropping them to a 4-up, and the White King is durable enough that you will probably get this passive effect for at least a couple of rounds before he eventually dies, even if he is in the thick of combat. The cheaper option is the regular White King, who is just on foot. This guy is only 100 points, and naturally he's got less wounds. He's only got 5. He's also a lot slower with only a 4-inch move. He does, however, have the same melee output from his Tomb Blade. He's got 5 attacks, 4s and 3s, 1 rend, 2 damage, and crit mortals. Of course, he doesn't get any bonus damage on the charge like the mounted counterpart, but then he is also a bit more of a buffing piece too. His rule, the King of Shambling Bones, lets you give a friendly Death Rattle unit within his combat range the crit 2 hits rule for the turn, which does make things like Barrow Guard really, really quite scary into the enemy. And then he also has a rule, Ancient Strategies, which is your standard fight with a hero and then pick a friendly Death Rattle infantry unit in his combat range and they can fight straight after him. So that's quite nice. The infantry unit does also get +1 to hit with this ability, so potentially making a unit of Barrow Guard hit on 2s and then get exploding 6s as well, which, as I said, can make them really, really scary. If you want a slightly lesser version of the White King, then the White Lord is up next. The White Lord on Steed he's actually only slightly more expensive than the White King on foot at 120 points. That gains you a 7 health hero with the same 10-inch move as the King and the same 3-up save. His Tomb Blade has the same profile as the White King's, but but is just 1 less attack, having 4 instead of 5, and then he brings you some more direct buffs to your cavalry units. His rule, Lord of the Trampling Bones, lets Death Rattle cavalry units wholly within 12 inches of him add 1 to their charge rolls, which does make them a lot more reliable at getting into combat, and then when they are in combat, his Royal Companions rule gives him the same fight after me mechanic that we saw on the White King on foot, so your Lord can swing and then a unit of Death Rattle cavalry in his combat range can fight immediately afterwards. So it's really nice. He doesn't give them any bonuses like the White King does, which is a shame, but either way, having 2 activations back to back is a really nice thing to have in Age of Sigmar, so it is a very, very welcome buff. In terms of the generic units that the Death Rattle can bring to the table, your basic Death Rattle skeletons are the most numerous. They cost you 100 points for 10, so you are paying 10 points for a 1 health, 4-inch move, 5 up save, 1 control model. So it's not amazing, and they're also not great in combat. They've got 2 attacks each, which are 4s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage, so even a fully reinforced unit of 20 will do about 5 damage to a 4-up save. So they really aren't great at killing. What they can do, despite their defensive profile, is actually survive annoyingly well, because their Warscroll rule is Skeleton Legion, and this allows them at the end of any turn to return D3 models to the unit. So alongside Deathly Invocation, they can be getting back up to 6 slain models, or even 9 near a Mortis Engine, and that does give them a lot of resilience when they are just sat holding an objective. They can last a really good long while if your opponent doesn't commit enough to wiping them out in a single round. So yes, they're not amazing, they're not great at killing, but they can actually be deceptively resilient if the enemy doesn't focus them down well enough. Moving on to the old Black Knights of the Graveguard, who are now the renamed and revamped Barrow Knights and Barrow Guard. The Barrow Knights are 210 points for 5, so they're actually only slightly cheaper than Blood Knights. They are 42 points per model, and they are 3 health with only a 4-up save, 10-inch move, and they also have less attacks than Blood Knights. They've got 2 each that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage. They do get +1 damage on the charge and have crit mortals, so that does help them do a load of damage on the charge, as well as keep them going when they are stuck in ongoing combats better with that crit mortals. But what these guys do really well is durability. They get a 5-up ward if they are within combat range of a Death Rattle cavalry hero, and they grant that ward to the hero as well, so giving something like your White King or your White Lord a very welcome 5-up ward. They also get to return a slain model to their unit at the end of any turn, so bringing back essentially a 42-point model up to 10 times in a game if you manage to do it every single turn. So that gives them a load of potential cost effectiveness. They really are a unit that can just keep going on and on and on, turn after turn after turn, and keep being effective right until the end of the battle. So I really like these guys, and I think if you are running a Death Rattle heavy list, they are a must-have for going alongside one of your mounted white heroes. The foot version is the Barrow Guard. These guys are a lot cheaper. They're 160 points for 10, which gets you the standard slow 4-inch move, 1 health. They do have a 4-up save, which is okay, and of course the usual 6-up ward. Now 16 points for a 4-up save, 6-up ward, and 1 health may not seem great, but they do have a similar rule to the Barrow Knights where they get a 5-up ward and can also give it to a Death Rattle foot hero in their combat range, thanks to Guardians of the King, so that does actually help them survive incoming damage a lot better. They're also, of course, a really good target for Deathly Invocation to get up to 3 of them back, and then in combat they're actually not bad. They've got 2 attacks each, which are 3s and 3s, 1 rend, 1 damage, and crit mortals. So yes, it's only 1 damage. I do miss the days when they could be 2 damage with their Great White Blades, but they can do quite a bit of work, and they can cut through even relatively good 3-up save units effectively, thanks to that mortal damage on 6s. So it's a really nice, fun Warscroll. It's a great update to the Graveguard, and they are still realistically just as useful as ever in your army. Moving from the Death Rattle units onto the Deadwalkers, we have a hero that kind of goes along with both of them, the Shambling Necromancer. He is 140 points, and honestly, he's much worse than he was before. 5 health and a 6-up save is fairly awful. He's got some pretty bad melee attacks with 3 that hit and wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage, so he isn't going to be killing much. He's mainly here to be a support wizard and also to buff your units, but he just doesn't do that very well. He can get a bit of extra durability with his Undead Minions rule, which gives him a 4-up ward, but then passes off any save damage to a nearby Death Rattle or Deadwalker unit, so kind of like we saw with Beladamma, he isn't actually saving you damage, he's just passing it on to a less important unit. What annoys me about the Necromancer is that he doesn't even have a Warscroll spell, and he's meant to be sort of, you know, a decent caster. His only other rule that he has is Van Hel's Dance Macabre, which lets you pick a Death Rattle or Deadwalker unit wholly within 12 inches of him in your combat phase, and they can use 2 fight abilities that phase, albeit with the second attempt having the Strike Last rule, which does sound really handy, and we see it to good use on a lot of things like Chaos Chosen and that sort of thing. Double activating on a unit is really good. The big issue with his version is that it only goes off on a 3+, so straight off the bat it's not that reliable, you know, 33% of the time it's not going to work, but also in some inexplicable way it costs you a command point to use that ability, and I just really don't get that. Why would you ever pay a command point to use an ability that could then fail? Either just make it cost a command point and go off automatically, or just leave it at the 3+ for it to work. Having both of those hoops to jump through makes it absolutely awful, and worst case situation is that 33% of the time you are just flat out spending a command point for nothing. So for me, the Necromancer, as he is at the moment, is utter trash. He needs a points drop, and he needs to have that ability either just go off on a 3+ or just cost you a command point to use. I mean, I don't see why. Personally, I think it should just be an ability he has if he's 140 points, because he doesn't really do much else. But having those 2 hoops and having him have such a bad output and defensive profile, he is just never going to be worth 140 points when you could bring a Vampire Lord for the same price. Onto these specific Deadwalker units though, we start off with the Corpse Cart. This is a 4-inch move, 7 health, 6-up save unit that essentially just buffs your zombies. It does have some abysmal melee. The Corpse Master has 3 attacks, 4s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage, and then you get 2d6 extra attacks from the zombies, which are again 4s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage. But this thing is only 70 points, and it does buff your Deadwalkers, so it grants them the crit auto wound rule while they are wholly within 12 inches. It's not a bad buff, auto wound is a nice buff, but I'm still not sure it's worth it, to be honest. Maybe if it gave your zombies crit mortals, I would like it more, but at the end of the day, you're paying 70 points to give auto wounds on not many 0 rend attacks, and I just don't know if that's worth it. The zombies that we're talking about here is the Deadwalker zombies. These are your cheapest chaff unit in terms of price per model. You get 20 of them for 140 points, and they can reinforce to a unit of 40 for 280 points, so they can be a really, really big roadblock for your opponent. They are only 1 health with a 6-up save and a 6-up ward, so they are going to die in droves, but that is kind of what they're there for. They've got 1 attack each, which is 5s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage. So they really aren't going to kill much of anything. But what they can do is that when they die, they have a rule called Mindless Ferocity, and that means that whenever a model in the unit dies and is in combat, you can roll a dice, and on a 6 you do a mortal damage back to the attacking unit. So if a full unit of 40 gets absolutely exploded by some charging Chaos Knights, you can expect to do around 6 or 7 mortal damage back, which I know isn't anything amazing. You're not going to make your points back with that, but it could be a very nasty surprise to an opponent, and if you have an enemy hero charging in that only has 5 or 6 health, and you really spiked your rolls, you could kill an enemy hero after they kill off a load of your zombies. Next up we have the Felbats. These are another fairly solid screening and harassment unit. 100 points gets you 3 of them, and they come with 3 health, another pretty awful 6-up save, but then they do have the decent 12-inch move and can of course fly. They only have a maximum control score of 1 thanks to being beasts, which means they aren't good at holding objectives, but I do think they have some value in helping you kill off some enemy chaff from an objective so that your other unit or another unit on there can actually claim it, and they do that relatively well. They've got 3 attacks each, which are 4s and 4s with no rend, so that may sound really bad, but they have 2 damage on their fangs, so that means when their attacks do go through, they can actually do a bit more than you might think. Now yes, it's not going to kill a whole unit by itself, I know that, but it can just kill off the last couple of models that you may need to help one of your other units actually steal that objective, so that is a definite use of the Felbat, and they can actually be also quite reactive with it, because they can charge even after retreating, thanks to Fleet and Fell. So they are very mobile and slippery, and you can put them into a combat where you do just need that extra tiny bit of damage going in. I think what may be a better option though, in my opinion, is the Direwolves. They are more expensive at 150 points, but that gets you 10 models instead of 3. Now they are only 2 health each, but that is still essentially double the number of wounds from the Fellbats. They're a bit slower with only a 10-inch move, but they do also have a better 5-up save, and I would say they are overall more useful. Their on the hunt ability lets them charge after they've run. So yes, it's more difficult for them to move from combat to combat in the later turns, but for getting that initial charge off into the enemy, they can be much more reliable. Your Direwolves are 2 attacks each at 4s and 3s, no rend and 1 damage, but they do get a lot more attacks than your Fellbats because of the bigger unit size and of course having a champion, so they will cut through chaff better than Fellbats, I think, and of course be much more durable in terms of unit when they're in combat. They also get a nice buff from Beladamma if you have her, because she can, as we saw, give them +1 rend, so that can make their melee actually significantly better into lightly armoured enemies. The final units in this army book are the 3 manifestations we now have: the Hand of Nagash, Unholy Reliquary, and Sanguine Swarm. The Hand of Nagash can move 8 inches and has 10 health and a 5-up save. It's got 5 moderate attacks. They hit on 4s, wound on 2s with 1 rend, 2 damage, and crit mortals, which isn't bad. It's similar-ish to a Vampire Lord's output into most things. But then what the Hand of Nagash does is you can pick an enemy unit in any combat phase that it is in combat with, and you roll a dice, and on a 4+, you can make that enemy unit either drop to a control score of 1 that can't be modified, or stop it using move abilities. So you can really lock down an enemy, or just make it terrible at holding objectives, so your other units can be used to more effectively steal it, or just to get around the enemy and get to another place on the board where you want them to be. It's also got a fairly cute rule in Inescapable Reach, which lets it move after it's been set up. So it still has to be set up 9 inches away from enemies, but then when you do set it up, you roll a d3, and on a 2+, you can move that many inches. So it's only going to be 2 or 3, but that could still get you 6 inches away from an enemy, and a much easier charge on the turn it's summoned. The Unholy Reliquary can't move, but it is set up 18 inches from the caster, which does help, and it allows you to get this thing where you need it to be. This allows you in any combat phase to either heal D3, a hero that is wholly within 12 inches of it, or give +1 attacks to that hero for the turn, and then you banish this manifestation. So you can either summon this to give some constant healing each combat phase to a hero that's in combat, or just do a one-off boost to your output if there is a fight that you absolutely need to win and finish off the enemy in. So they're both not bad options. I would say the healing is probably the most useful if you've got sort of a big, heavy combat going on in the middle of the board, but the extra attack can be a really big clutch play if you just need that 1 extra attack to really punch through the enemy that you're fighting. The final manifestation is Sanguine Swarm. This is a 12-inch move, 6 health, 6-up save manifestation. It has a load of chip damage attacks. It can do 10 of them that only hit and wound on 5s with no rend and 1 damage, but they do have crit mortals, so you are essentially just fishing for 6s to get that damage through. It does also get to heal whenever it scores a critical hit, so you're doing a mortal damage and healing yourself back up whenever you do roll a 6 to hit, which can keep it going a bit longer. But either way, this is still a very squishy manifestation, and it will die exceptionally fast against any target. The other rule it has is multiple parts, because this thing actually comes in 2 parts, and they have to be within 9 inches of each other whenever they move. But despite being 2 parts, it's still only 6 health in total, and once you lose those 6 health, both parts die. But what it does mean is that each part has those 10 attacks, so you actually have 20 attacks in total, which does mean you can get a few more crits from it. But either way, it's still not the most terrifying output, and I think, you know, even if you are sending both into the same unit, you're going to get about 3 mortals through, and then this thing is probably going to die on the return swings. And then finally we come to our new terrain piece, the Cursed Sepulchres. We saw these are part of your army rule now, and they bring you some buffs there, but what they actually are in terms of their war scroll is they have 8 health and a 4-up save, and they have their own war scroll rules. First up is Locus of Shaish, which means you can use them to cast a summon spell and use the sort of range and visibility from them rather than your own model if you want. So if you need to get a manifestation right on the other end of the board and your caster that you're using is, right in your backfield, you can use this to get some extra range or visibility to get them right where you need. And then they also get a rule, Leeching Soil, which lets you heal these terrain features whenever an enemy or a friendly model is slain within 9 inches of them. So this just helps them to stick around a bit longer as you and your opponent are fighting nearby to them. They're nothing amazing, but they do have some utility use with the extended spellcasting, and they are, of course, a big part of how the Soulblight play in terms of your army rules now. So they are important to have. They are also free points-wise anyway, so they are definitely worth picking up and adding into your army. And that is the Soulblight Gravelords. They are a very fun, a very thematic army book. It has lost some power in a few of the units, I would say, but equally, I think it's got a lot of strength, it's got a lot of versatility, and it is a very good army for bringing back a load of models. You've got some amazing recursion, it's got some exceptional spellcasting from a few of the units, and quite importantly, it's got one of the best model ranges in the entire game at the moment. So I'm a really big fan of this army book. I think it's really cool. I think whether you are a fan of vampires or zombies or skeletons or a mix of all of them together, you can definitely get something that you like to play and enjoy playing, and that will also be quite powerful with this book. As always though, I'd really love to know what you think of this new army book and which armies and formations you have been playing around with. Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me. But until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.